kind of legislation do we need to fight against? What kind of legislation is currently on the books that we need to try to change? What kind of legislation are people imagining and dreaming up that, that we want to support and try to implement? It's basically because we currently live under a legislative regime that treats people differently, that creates different legal statuses and treats people differently because of those legal statuses. And one of the questions that I don't actually hear it that much because people don't dare say it to me, but I see it all the time, especially every time I log onto a newspaper article and look at the comments about immigration and look at the comment section, or lots of different blogs that people send me or that just kind of come my way, is what part of illegal don't you understand? As if illegal was some kind of a fact rather than a legally created status. And I always want to turn around and ask the question, well, what part of illegal do you understand? Like, have you ever really thought about or looked historically at how and why we have created different legal statuses? So what I want to do in my first 5 minutes is to kind of denaturalize illegality. And look at how and why we've created different legal statuses, how we've used them, what purpose they have served to different societies over time, and how we've come to sort of naturalize this idea of illegality, that different legal statuses should exist and that people should belong in them and be treated differently by the law because they belong to different legal categories, different legal statuses. And I'm going to look at 500 years of different legal statuses, but I am going to do it now in 3 minutes because that's all I have left for myself. But I just wanted to draw a couple of historical parallels and look at some historical evolution of categories of how the laws have enforced social differences. And what I want to argue is that since the beginning of colonialism, say 1492, categorizing people and parceling them out into different legal categories has been a key aspect of establishing domination. And when we think about colonialism, the colonial era starting in 1492, we usually think about European expansion, right? But if we go back to 1492, that's an anachronism. That is, there was no such thing as Europe. The people who were expanding and defining themselves as legally superior and conquering other people, expelling other people, excluding other people, deciding who got to be where and who got to be treated as a human being and who didn't get to be treated as a human being, defined themselves as Christians. That is, it was religion that separated people and that made laws that excluded people and treated people differently. We can look back to the Crusades, where Christians tried to drive infidels from the Holy Land. We can look back at the Spanish reconquest. I anachronistically use the word Spanish, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, where the goal was to drive out Jews and Muslims to create a Christian state in Spain and Portugal. And this Christian conquest of that Iberian Peninsula actually finishes in 1492, when the last Muslim kingdom in southern Spain is abolished, and laws expelling Jews and Muslims from this Christian territory are enforced in the entire territory. And this moves directly, of course, into Spain and Portugal's, again, Christian conquests of the New World. The Catholic, los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic king and queen of Spain who sponsored this, and the idea that the conquest was in the name of a Christian god. In this colonial project in the Americas, the Spanish and those that followed them, the British, the French, Christians, started to define themselves not only as Christian, but as they were using Christianity to establish their domination over people who now were from Africa, from the Americas, who were black, who were indigenous, ideas about race started to overlay on top of ideas about religion. And the legal situation started to change too. That is, instead of laws privileging Christians, they started to transform these, to evolve them, to sort of have accretions coming into them, into laws that defined people legally by race. In Spanish America, there was legally a República de Indios, the Indian Republic, who were subject to different laws. Only people of African descent were legally eligible to be enslaved, the legal status of blackness. And Spanish ideas about purity of blood, which had previously referred to religion, that is, to have pure blood meant to be able to believe, to prove that you were ancestrally Christian, that all of your ancestors back from time immemorial had been Christian. You weren't one of those new Christians who just tried to convert. Those ideas about purity of blood started transforming into ideas about race being a characteristic of the blood. And most of us are probably very familiar with racial ideas and ideologies that attribute race to something about blood. You have this kind of blood, you have that kind of blood. And if you think about the 19th century, what we think of today as nationalities, like French or German or European nationalities, and in the 19th century defined themselves by blood. That is, you had French blood, you had German blood. That is what we now think of as nation-state. Up through the 19th century and well into the 20th, actually was thought of as something much more racial than the way we think of it now. In the United States as well. That is, citizenship as the nation-state started to define itself in the 19th century was defined by race. It had nothing to do with, as it does now, birthplace. Belonging, citizenship was legally restricted to free white people. And, of course, slavery of people of African descent was inherently built into the new nation that was founded here, the nation-state. So it's over the course of the 20th century that our contemporary ideas about nation, and that nationality, nation-state, having something to do with something inherent about the person that has to do with where you are born, and that should define your rights, is really a post-Civil War idea. When race starts to, on a long journey, which it still hasn't finished, but it starts to lose its legitimacy as a legal category for exclusion. So after the Civil War, there's racial exclusions on citizenship are opened up, and instead birth exclusions on citizenship are put into place. That is, the 14th Amendment allows people of African descent to be citizens for the first time, but citizenship now is defined by birth. There are still racial exclusions on citizenship at the end of the 19th century, because citizenship is restricted to people who are white or of African descent. Notice that there are two non-comparable categories. That is, one has to do with place of African descent, that has to do with a place. White has to do with some undefined idea about race, what white means, but that's how the law is written, white people and people of African descent. Other people who don't fall into either of those two categories by race or place are not allowed to become citizens, they're not allowed to naturalize, and this is where the Chinese Exclusion Act comes in. And then after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the whole Asiatic barred zone, in which about 2/3 of the world's territory is denied the right to come here or the right to be citizens. Now, is this based on race or place, the Chinese Exclusion Act? Is Chinese a race, or is it a nationality? Is it a place? They don't, I mean, nobody ever defines these things, but we think we understand them. So this imposition of legal identities based on something that's sort of accepted as a natural fact but never really fully articulated, I think is behind this question, what part of illegal don't you understand? Well, nobody really understands any part of it. We just sort of make assumptions that, well, that's how the law is, so it must make sense if that's the law, right? Where does that leave us today? Today, we have laws against discrimination, right? Discrimination is legally prohibited. Discrimination, that doesn't mean that discrimination still doesn't exist, but there's the social fact and the legal fact. At least by law, racial discrimination is outlawed. And since there was one wave of denaturalizing race during the Reconstruction period, and a second wave of denaturalizing, delegalizing race in the Civil Rights period through the 1960s. I want to tell you a little anecdote about how nation-state nationality has replaced race as a justification for discrimination. In a panel that I was on about a year ago with a young woman from the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. We have a Commission Against Discrimination against Massachusetts because discrimination is illegal, but only some kinds of discrimination are illegal. So this young woman was talking about the New Bedford raid. Is that something you're familiar with in 2007, where factories raided in New Bedford and hundreds of workers, most of them Central American, many of them undocumented, were arrested, detained, taken to Texas, many of them deported, many of them still fighting legal cases, families separated, just horrible situation. So she said, of course discrimination is illegal in Massachusetts, and we enforce that. Everybody has the right not to be discriminated against. So when the raid happened in New Bedford, the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination sent a team down to New Bedford to make sure that nobody was being discriminated against. And we succeeded in making sure that no one was discriminated against during this raid. And that's exactly what I said. Excuse me, hello? Like, weren't people being, like, arrested and deported because of arbitrary characteristics? Like, isn't that discrimination? She said, oh, no, that's legal. They're supposed to be deported. They're illegal. What we wanted to make sure is that they weren't being discriminated against on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexual preference, on the basis of religion, while they were being deported because of their nationality. So that's sort of the background to, like, what is legal, what is not legal. Clearly we're faced with a very discriminatory set of laws in this country right now that treats people differently on the basis of a legally ascribed status that makes no sense in human terms, but is legally inscribed into people. This is what your status is, and then people say, well, that's the law. The law says that's your status, therefore we have to discriminate because that's what the law says. So what are some of the specific laws that are currently on the books that are in process of discussion right now that we need to be thinking about? There are several particularly noxious laws that are under discussion in Massachusetts right now. There's many noxious laws that already exist that we need to think about changing, but the one that is, like, right on the hot plate right now for us to pay attention to is the Secure Communities Law. This is a federal program that that does something in a lot of ways similar to the law in Arizona that so many people decried so much. What Secure Communities does is it creates an automatic link between every local law enforcement agency and ICE, which is the current incarnation of the INS that you were just reading about. So this means that anytime somebody is arrested, booked, their information is going to directly go to ICE, and ICE will decide whether this person should, in addition to whatever they may have been arrested for, it could be something as minor as a traffic violation. Often it's a violation of driving without a license. Since the law makes it impossible for somebody who is undocumented to get a driver's license, therefore many people who are undocumented are guilty of the crime of driving without a license because the law makes it impossible for them to get a license. So it turns what are currently minor infractions for which people have to pay a small fine, it turns them into deportable offenses. Governor Deval Patrick has taken a really mixed and schizophrenic attitude towards immigrants' rights and laws affecting immigration. There's three other good laws, and I'll come back to Deval Patrick in just a minute, three other good laws that currently don't exist in Massachusetts, but that I'd like to mention that are, again, on the table that people are fighting for right now. None of them are going to solve the problems created by our immigration law, but at least they're tiny steps in the right direction and to help us be asking these questions about why should people be treated differently under the law. One of them is the in-state tuition law. That is, students who are undocumented, according to federal law, Supreme Court decision of 1982, they cannot be discriminated against by the public schools through grade 12. That kind of discrimination is illegal on the basis of this legally ascribed status. However, after you graduate from high school, suddenly your status overtakes your humanity, and you cannot be considered a state resident in order to attend an institution of higher learning in Massachusetts. So you may have lived here as long as you need to be a state resident, but because of your status, you can't be considered a state resident. In-state tuition would grant the potential for state residency to people who are undocumented in the same way or in a parallel way to how it's granted to people who are citizens or, quote, legal immigrants. So in-state tuition is one law that's currently going to be up in this coming legislative session, so keep your eyes open for it. It's come up numerous times and it's been shot down every time, but it's something that we can still fight for. 11 states have passed in-state tuition laws, so it's certainly something that we can imagine achieving in Massachusetts as well. A second kind of law that is currently not up, but I think it's within the realm of possibility to bring up, is driver's licenses. That is, until the Real ID Act was passed by the Bush administration in 2003, people who were undocumented could get driver's licenses everywhere in the United States. The Real ID Act made it impossible, but there are states that have challenged the Real ID Act. And New Mexico, for example, you do not have to prove that you're a citizen to get a driver's license. So it would be conceivable for Massachusetts to follow the lead of New Mexico and say we do not want to discriminate in the granting of driver's licenses. And finally, at the federal level is the DREAM Act, which does something in some ways comparable to the In-State Tuition Act, but it goes further. It creates a path to citizenship for young people who are undocumented who choose to pursue higher education or to join the military. It creates a path to citizenship that currently doesn't exist. So currently, just like race, religion in the past, people who are illegal are permanently illegal. There's no way to get out of your status. It's just what you are, and you are it forever. So the DREAM Act would open a small path. So what has our Massachusetts governor said about all of these different things? Well, just a few months ago, or about a year ago, Patrick convened what he called the New Americans Agenda, a bunch of pro-immigrant organizations where he asked them to put forth a legislative agenda. What could Massachusetts do to be more welcoming to immigrants? And two of the specific things on this New Americans Agenda were in-state tuition and driver's license. That is, those are two things that can be changed at the state level to make Massachusetts more welcoming. About 2 months ago, Patrick, with a big fanfare, invited all of the organizations to formally accept the New Americans Agenda and say how he supported it and how much he liked it, and this was his baby. And some of the people at the event said, well, are you actually going to then push for driver's licenses and in-state tuition? And he said, oh no, we can't do that. It's too complicated and it might be violating federal law. Well, Deval Patrick is the governor. He should know what the federal law says and doesn't say, and he should know what other states are doing, and that in fact Massachusetts could very well do those things. But that's where he left it. He gave us another disappointment just a few weeks ago in the end of December when he announced that he was planning to sign Massachusetts on to Secure Communities. Secure Communities is the program I was just describing a few minutes earlier. And many people protested and said, wait a minute, why signing Massachusetts on to secure communities. And his response was, well, we don't really know, but we think it's going to be imposed on us, even if we don't, so we may as well go ahead and sign it. Again, this makes no sense. He's the governor. He should know what the law is, and he should, if he thinks secure communities is unjust, instead of saying, well, we're going to sign it because we think they're going to eventually make us do it, he should say, no, we don't want them to make us do it. So I think that our governor is somebody who we should really be paying attention to now in terms of what kind of laws do we want to, what kind of legislative change do we want to push, and we should also be looking at the state legislature in terms of specifically in-state tuition as it's coming up this spring. At the national level, there's been talk over previous years about something they call comprehensive immigration reform. The proposals that are currently on the table, there's nothing immediately on the table, but the proposals that have been discussed in the last 3 years or so for comprehensive immigration reform, I do not think they're just proposals. I don't think that there's any proposal out there that truly talks about treating people equally. All of the proposals are based on reinforcing and maintaining these status differences. Therefore, at this point in time, I don't think it makes sense for us to talk about a comprehensive immigration reform, unless we want to talk about really rethinking what we mean by comprehensive immigration reform. I do think we need one, but we need to redefine it before we can talk about supporting it. We can, though, at the national level, even though it doesn't have any chance of passing anymore, it did a few months ago, but it will be coming up again, the DREAM Act. These small, piecemeal kinds of changes I see not just as changes that will be beneficial to some people on their own, but also as changes that will help us move towards talking about the bigger issues of do we really want to live under a legal system that ascribes status and treats people differently because of the statuses that are ascribed to them. So thank you, and I'll take questions. Thanks.
Before we open for questions, we'll close with music,
Okay.
and then we'll do questions, bring you right back up.
Great.
So Heather, if you want to come back up.